All right, good morning. Welcome to the Thurston County Board of County Commissioners Work Session. It's Wednesday, June 21st, 2023. It is 9:02 a.m. My name is Ty Menzer, Vice Chair of the Board. Commissioner Carolina Mejia is on Zoom platform. To my left is Commissioner Gary Edwards, County Manager Miro Chavez, Community Planning and Economic Development Director Josh Cummings. We have 5 of our planning commissioners here at present. We may be getting a couple more here. Virtual attendance is provided through the Thurston County YouTube channel. We are live streaming, correct?
Yep.
And the topic today is basically a kind of a briefing meeting with our planning commissioners. Try to do this on at least an annual basis, and it's been a while, so it's good to have everybody here. And who's opening up?
If I may, for the record, if you can introduce yourself, so we can
we'll
capture
go
the sound.
around.
Okay.
Yeah, you won't be on the screen, but you'll be here.
We're still working on the camera.
Sure. Derek Day, Plan Commission.
Eric Casino, and I live in District 2.
Scott Nelson, District 3.
Jim Simmons, District 3. Yeah, Nelson, District 3.
All right, District 3 showing up.
Yeah.
I'd like to see. All right.
So, Commissioner, on your packet,
Yep.
there is some an AIS document
Yep.
where there is a points of discussion the Planning Commission developed. They would like to have a conversation with you.
Okay.
As you can see, the number 1 is the role of the Planning Commission in Thurston County. I have provided a copy of the PowerPoint of the training all of us attended early in the year, which I believe it was a good training. It really outlines what the role of the Planning Commission, what the role of the legislative authority is. And really is an open conversation at this point, if I may, from the Planning Commission members.
Okay, well, I could just walk us through this as we go, but I'm gonna look to the chair a little bit, Mr. Casino, to Eric, too. You know, how long you want to spend on the various topics. It's really, you guys can see how the discussion goes, or go ahead and kind of what you wanted to.
Well, I guess we should just start with this, with what we lined out a couple of weeks ago with staff on some of the issues that the Planning Commission wanted to talk to the board about. I think there was a couple of big themes that are of interest to the Planning Commission, and some of our planning commissioners are not here that were really interested in some of these issues. So I feel a little bit out of place bringing them up, but we could try to go through them the best we can. And I think the first big question is, what is the role of the Planning Commission as it relates to the Board of County Commissioners? What are we supposed to be doing? And the 2 options that we see this as is, 1, are we an independent investigative commission that comes up with recommendations outside of anybody else's input? We're just doing the best that we think should be done. And the opposite of that would be, are we trying to anticipate what the board is wanting to see happen and trying to implement the board's will in our decision making? And I think that over the course of years, we've had direction both ways on that particular issue. And as the board changes, the direction to the commission might change. And so getting some definitive answers from the board would probably make the commission's job a little bit easier. Josh, did that make sense?
From the perspective of the planning commissioners that I think you're trying to speak for, I think we're missing a piece of this puzzle, but.
Yeah. So maybe getting some direction from the board about how you see the commission and how it should be doing its deliberations and coming to its decisions would be really, really helpful.
Chair, you had 2 options, the independent or anticipate what the board's trying to say. The independence of the Planning Commission versus the other option of anticipating what the Board of County Commissioners would like to expect from the Planning Commission. Can you provide a little more examples of what you mean with that, or?
I think that where we've seen this happen before, there have been times where our deliberations have been whether or not we should consider what we think the board wants. So I think at one point with a previous board in a previous time, we had direction from the board with the Shoreline Master Program to come up with the least restrictive possible regulations that this state would allow. And then later we heard from the board that we should come to these decisions on what we think without consideration of the board or without consideration of the state. And we should do what we think is right. And so we could go either way on that. I mean, if I feel like that I am supposed to be implementing the will of the board, my decisions might be different than what I think if I'm implementing my own personal will.
I guess, do you sometimes feel that staff is trying to steer you in one direction or the other that they feel might be reflective of the board or maybe their own particular bias? Does that ever come up where you're kind of getting guidance that maybe you don't agree with, but is slanted one way or the other?
Well, I think that yes, and I think that is necessary often because often there are side rails that are legal issues that need to be considered that we don't consider. Now, on policy decisions that are outside of the side rails of the law, we do take recommendations from staff as they are the subject matter experts on many of these issues. I don't know if there is a disconnect between staff recommendations and what the board's direction would be. I don't know that part, but it'd be hard for me to speak to their particular motivations, but it does leave some confusion on the planning commissions. Like sometimes a lot of planning commissioners that are like, well, we know that the board wants this. Another time we'll have planning commissioners of, we are the fact-finding body. This is our job to explore all these issues. So we need to bring all these different options to the board, whether they're thinking of them or not.
Just as a follow-up
Yeah.
to that, because it was mentioned, do you have somebody from the prosecutor's office that represents the board? Are they in attendance at your meetings or only if you ask for them to come? I mean, I'm kind of curious, how come even today we don't have legal representation here to kind of let us know that, well, you don't want to get over here. Somebody that's an expert in how the board is supposed to function. I mean, the planning commission, how it's supposed to function. I honestly don't know the answer to all those things. That's what I'm a little curious. I'd like to see, but maybe we don't have an expert on staff that's a legal expert. I don't know the answer to that.
But if there are specific questions related to any legal perspective, we can certainly reach those answers if any confusion. But that's what the reason I brought this, because I believe that it was a good training as an overall umbrella as to what the roles of the planning commission is versus the board of county commissioners, and that is really stated on statute, I believe. But I think is what the chair is mentioned is more of what a little more in the granular level, what type of direction, or expectations the board has as a result of the planning commission engagement in many aspects. I think that's a little bit different question than perhaps what the role of the planning commission is. My take on that, if I may, is I think any expectations of the board should be in writing. It should be all three board members. They have to communicate and agree upon what the message will be to the planning commission. And I think that's probably fair for all of you to understand if there is a specific set of expectations the board has. It has to come from the board, has to be official, it has to be discussed in public. Either they give me the direction to provide that direction or that expectation. And the one that I recall was on the following up on setting up the public hearing for the SMP, I believe. That was very direct. That was the direction the board gave me to send to the planning commission. That's the last direction really the board directed me to do, and send a message to the planning commission. So I think
But can I jump in?
Sorry, go ahead.
So I think that's correct, but I think we also need to talk about the fact that sometimes we're not getting, there's some questions asked about the scope that the planning commission has asked. For example, the wireless code was one of the big ones. I remember in just reviewing those meetings that there were questions about like, okay, well then what's, the scope? And staff were like, well, the board sets the scope, and they were pretty hard on that, but that messaging never came back to the Board of County Commissioners, right? We were never consulted or informed that, this is what's going on during, these are the questions that are being asked by the Planning Commission in regards to scoping. Is the board interested, or is the board interested in following something different? And so that was some of the things where I saw some gaps in communication.
I don't know who's running the meeting, Madam Chair, are you running the meeting, sir? My own preference is, I don't want to see the planning commission rubber stamp anything, I guess, whether it comes from staff or the county commissioners. I'm kind of more in tune with, look at the facts that are being presented. Now, if legal says, well, yeah, you have to do this, or whatever this is, I think that's maybe different than staff saying, well, we want the most stringent regulatory process in place, or the most lenient process in place. I don't think that those ought to be just rubber stamped. That's where you folks come in as a citizen advisory board, in my estimation. So that, because you're actually going to get the facts. Oftentimes it'll come to us for a vote. And we're going to take some information in. We're going to look at your recommendation and probably even the minority report, so it isn't always the majority. And staff gives us their feelings, and maybe it's contrary for whatever reason to what you're recommending. But I think then that's up to us to make that determination of, well, where am I coming from as an individual? I don't want it as restrictive as legally possible. I'm more leaning towards, well, I probably want it less restrictive, but others might want it more restrictive. So that's where the board maybe comes up, and even given direction, I think if that's where it's going to come from, it's probably got to be what the majority of the board says, because we don't always agree. And that's not fair to you folks to try and figure out everything. And that's why I think it's pretty important for you to be independent and not rubber stamp anything. Just, what are the facts? What do you think would fit better in our community? And make a recommendation accordingly. Because I look at you guys as kind of the ones that have more information than we have.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with what Commissioner Edwards said. I mean, I don't think it's like the topics that have to come through your commission are topics. There's a reason why they're coming through your commission. It's like there's details and there's things that we don't, even if a commissioners are really excited about, maybe somebody comes in and says, I have this great idea about, X, let's put this, industrial, office park somewhere. Oh, that sounds kind of cool. But there's so many details underneath that. That's why it goes through a process. So as excited as you might think the commissioners are about something, or what you heard at a meeting, or what you've talked to, like that should not, you guys should be making independent, because you're going to evaluate more facts. On the flip side, when it comes to us, I hope you all feel that, I don't want anyone's feelings to be hurt if we have to go a different way, because we're balancing other stuff. We may get new like some people don't even get involved until it's at commissioner level. They're just not keyed in enough to local government to come and talk to you guys. We're going to hear new public input, always happens. We've got budgetary considerations. We have certain political we have things that we're balancing that you guys aren't balancing. So we may come to a different point of view even though we think you guys did a perfect job of working through the issue. And we hope that that's something that, you know, doesn't hurt your feelings or anything like that. But at the same time, I don't want the, you know, I was involved in that one that Eric mentioned where I just new to the board and I had heard that, you know, that there'd been direction or a perceived direction that the S&P was supposed to be the least restrictive, and I wasn't sure that was right. I was brand new to the whole thing. I really didn't know. But I certainly didn't think that the board should have been trying to predetermine an outcome like that. So I brought it to the board and I said, did we give formal direction in that? And no, I mean, somebody had a conversation with somebody, but it hadn't been what Ramiro said. There hadn't been a vote of the board or a letter sent or anything. So we sent a letter saying, that's not any kind of formal direction, whatever you might have heard from a particular county commissioner. Because I think the county manager is right. If we're gonna give that kind of direction, and I would be very reluctant to do so on a substantive matter. Now, the process is a little different. We did do the thing about let's get a public hearing set. But on substance, I would probably never, you know, think that we should be sending such a letter. But if we did, it should be a letter from the board, you know, not just hearsay or planning commissioners interpreting what commissioners might have said at meetings or whatever. If you guys have to go through the process, you're gonna take in information and have discussions that, you know, most of the projects, you do some small things, but you do a lot of big things, you know, whether it's wireless code or sub-area plans and stuff, and you know, you've got to walk through a process and balance a lot of information to come to your recommendations for us. So,
Yep. Yeah, excuse me. Go
I
ahead.
think that maybe splitting this topic in half is really, would be productive. One of the issues is the lensing. How do we look at this as independent or with direction from the board? And the other topic, like Commissioner Mejia had mentioned on, is the actual scoping of what we're going to look at. So if we look at it through the lensing idea, it would be pretty easy to say that the commissioners are probably telling us that we need to be independent when we look at these particular issues. That's kind of the feeling I'm getting from you folks right now. And I think that would probably settle the issue to consider it like that. But that doesn't address the question of the scoping. What are our sideboards on issues? Obviously, the big sideboards are the docket. You guys set the docket and we do everything that's in the docket. Now, once we get to a particular docket item, how are those sideboards set? Like on our comprehensive plan update that we're going to start working on this next year, we've already had a lot of discussions about what the sideboards for the Planning Commission are, and the Planning Commission has shown an interest in having the whole thing opened up and every topic in the comprehensive plan being available for discussion. That's a big lift though, and that makes things take a long, long time. So there's probably going to have to be some sideboards somewhere along the way. And how are those determined? That's all I got.
But I think, you know, if I may.
Yeah.
Following up to your comment, Mr. Chair, as well as a comment from Madam Chair, I think we, you know, looking from their perspective, I think we need to make an effort. That if the Planning Commission has specific questions about any specific item, whether it's sideboards, scope of work, or anything, you know, a formal, you know, documentation to the board will also be helpful. So, and then the board will assess that. And I think, you know, as you should be expecting a formal documentation from the board and any expectations, directions. I think it also will be great to have a formal letter. And you have sent, you know, letters on minority report or whatever that is, clarifying any specific issues. From my point of view, that has been very helpful to the board. Maybe a formal clarification questions that you have, you know, in cooperation with staff may be helpful also to the board.
I would agree with that. And I think one of the things that's important for both the board and the planning commission to recognize is we have one goal as staff, and that's to serve the Board of County Commissioners in their request to have items addressed, have public input received, and have it move forward. What we hear repeatedly from Commissioner Edwards especially is how come things aren't moving faster. And so when you ask for more input, things naturally will slow down. And I think to the county manager's point, if the planning commission has something that you all agree on that you think should be in the work plan, that's not in the work plan that the board has approved, some united letter to the Board of County Commissioners, because the board sets our work plan. And we have one singular goal, and that's to move items forward with public input. But if you have got an addition to that, and staff is like, we think we understand what you're saying, but that's gonna increase the work plan load and the timing is going to slow down, it would be helpful for that to be sent to the Board of County Commissioners. In your role as advisory to the board, that's where that piece comes in. And I think there maybe has been a bit of a disconnect in that, where the Planning Commission doesn't direct staff. The Board of County Commission directs our team with the work plan. And so if there's a place where you feel like there's more to be added, knowing that the Board of County Commissioners will then have to assess resources and accept, commissioners, that time may slow on completing docket items, we would accept a change to our work plan, obviously.
Didn't we kind of do that with the agricultural issues?
Yeah,
You
exactly.
guys said, we're not gonna be able to get what we need to get with this current scope. We think you should expand the scope. You sent a letter. We chewed on that for a while, and then we did expand the scope and spent the resources, and I think actually sitting here as a result of that, as a human being hired as a result of the recommendations you guys brought forward to us, so it does happen that way. I do think we kind of set the initial, I think there was I was hearing chatter that there was debate about, like I think in some, I may have this wrong, but there's like other forms of planning commissions and they set the docket or something. Am I getting that right? That's not how we do it. The board sets the docket here. And so that's kind of how I see it. And then, so in my view, you don't have to do anything. You can just be reactive to the items that the board, now, if you guys feel like, because you have a lot of experience on other issues, that you have a strong opinion that, why wasn't this, we think this would be better if we included this, then you give us that kind of input, and it's up to us to chew on that. It's a very highly informed recommendation from a, kind of like public input. But I do think we set the docket items, and we set the scope of the comp plan update, for example. Input can be received on that for sure. And we did, we got input and we considered that. And I think we ended up voting I didn't vote for all the items. I voted for most of them. I think majority of the board voted for all of the items on the comp plan. So not your guys' input was discussed in that discussion. I think what maybe comes up is, if you're looking at an item within the scope of what you're doing and you think that there's an element of it that needs to be explored, right? Like, weren't you guys chewing on like housing in Grand Mound or something like that? Was there more data needed to really do a good job? And then that becomes a thing about, well, can you guys request data so that, and then staff goes and collects that data? So I'm thinking about this as being maybe the gray areas are where like there's an element of an identified item that planning commissioners feel need a little more, need an extra dimension added, and then are you allowed to ask staff to go include that, or do you have to come to the board? Is that kind of maybe a question that you're asking that maybe comes up?
I think that is the level of granularity that I think we're kind of struggling with, and kind of it's felt like there's a lack of process for how to actually do that. I think it's left us in a position where we can have differing opinions than staff, and I don't think that's appropriate at all. So if we can have process to resolve some of that, I think it could be really, really useful. I think we've.
I have a question. Could I follow up on that? You said you didn't want to have differing opinions with staff.
So as an example, the comp plan update, originally we were told that we were gonna have no role in advising the scope of the comp plan in the scoping at all, making any recommendation there. And there wasn't a clear pathway to resolve that difference. So that kind of procedural difference more than like
I'm curious about that, because that's staff giving them direction, and that's, I guess I'd like to know more about that. Why would we've
shared this with you. This is the scoping is choosing the chapters that the staff should present to the planning commission. I think that the word scoping may be a term of art, but it's clearly the board's role and responsibility to choose we have the mandatory items that commerce requires, and then the optional items. And that's what we were reflecting, was we appreciate the perspective of the planning commission and their concepts of what they think should be added in the optional items for the chapters. But that's really a board decision. And once that decision is made by the board, then the planning commission can have conversations about what's included within that scope of work. And so maybe there is a conversation about what the word scope means, but from staff's perspective, the chapters and what we work on, what the planning commission works on, is clearly defined as a board decision. So maybe that was.
No, I think I fully understand that.
Okay.
I appreciate it fully. And I think the issue was that scoping decision wasn't gonna have any input from the planning commission before it went to the board of commissioners. So that was the original kind of process flow. And I think that we saw as a problem, and we didn't really have a process to resolve that difference.
If I may, and I think it goes back to a question you asked earlier, Commissioner, about if the staff is giving us direction. And I think it's just inevitable, because we all bring our own experiences and biases and everything to the work that we do, and the bad day we had yesterday and all that stuff. And so everybody's bringing that. But when I here looking at page 4 of this, when it shows the policymakers, the county commissioners in orange, the planning commission in gray, and staff, the professionals in blue, I think we have a situation where these lines are thick and this one is thinner, the communication directly from the planning commission to the county commission, and it puts staff in a difficult position, because you're always interpreting and you know, we're always playing telephone back and forth, and we have less direction. And so this is addressing that directly, that we're getting a chance to communicate directly with the commission. But I think that's helpful, and if we can have more feedback that goes directly to the commission, and the commission has more feedback that comes directly to us, and then we also get the feedback that comes through the professional people, I think it gives us a more robust understanding of what it is we're supposed to be doing and what it is that we're all working towards, because it better informs our view, I think. Does that make sense? It's just, when I look, this is a very visual demonstration to me that, you know, these are happening, these lines are happening, and this one is not happening as much, in my opinion. So it's hard to identify the thing that is absent.
I think I key in on that very clearly, because I think if I'm reflecting back on some of those original conversations, you can see that staff isn't supposed to interpret that top line. And I think that there was a conversation of, if the planning commission has something directly to say to the board of county commissioners, feel free, right? And maybe that could have been done with a softer approach. But I think that top line, I think you're keying in on a very key piece.
I appreciate that, really, you highlighting that connection. But I think to the benefit of, you know, both bodies in a way, any communication has to be formal. So I think eliminates any type of interpretation or any type of misunderstandings. If it's a direction from the board, has to be formal. The board needs to agree, majority or not. And the same with the planning commission. If there's any particular correspondence that you need to send to the board of county commissioners, I believe that you're free to do so, as long as the planning commission agrees as a whole or in part. And I think that probably is going to create a much better environment as to how that line on top can be straightened.
Okay.
Makes a lot of sense.
Thank you. I apologize. I was in transit. My daughter had a talent show this morning, but I've been listening to the full conversation. Take it over from here. Okay.
Down this way.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm gonna throw something in here, going back to the comp plan discussion. Because I will say I'm probably the most adamant on the planning commission that comp plan review is not up for discussion. That, yes, there are mandatory and there are optional items, but I do not believe that state law allows you to choose not to review optional items. the whole point of the comp plan review is to look over the comp plan. And for those of you that don't know, that's kind of where I got into this. Thurston County lost at the hearings board on this exact decision because they said it was the zoning. Thurston County said, we're not going to look at that. That's not part of our scope. And hearings board said, it's your comp plan review period. You have to look at the whole comp plan. And so I guess the point I would make is optional items are optional whether or not the three of you decide to have them in the comp plan. You can say, you know, oh, this is an optional item, we don't want it, we're gonna get rid of it. But I don't think you can say, this is an optional item, so we don't have to review it now. Because, I mean, what's the point of a regular comp plan review if you don't review everything?
So you're saying it's optional as to whether it's in there, period.
Yes.
But if it's in there,
And
it gets reviewed.
And I believe if the three of you say, I think health is one of them. If the three of you say, well, we're not gonna review that. I'm pretty sure that somebody like FutureWise will come along and challenge that at the hearings board. I'm pretty sure you'll lose. And I'm pretty sure that that will open up the entire comp plan to another review by whoever challenges it.
And that question has been asked and answered, and we wouldn't, as the county, say that we're not going to review it. We'd say that the current review is up to date. And so that there's a nuance there where if it's been reviewed recently and it doesn't look like chapters need review and the Board of County Commissioners, this is not staff's recommendation. This is the board's review. And if the board decides that the current optional chapter is up to date, then it's not getting kicked out. And there's a nuance there that I think we need to make sure that it's clarified. And that's up to the board's discretion.
Go ahead.
I think that issue is one of those issues that we should have somebody from legal, you know, saying, yeah, you gotta review all this or not. But it sounds like when that went in front of the hearings examiner, someone gave some bum information to the planning commission, possibly, it must have been a staff person, that said, well, you don't have to do this, or you can't.
County commissioners decided they didn't have to.
Well, yeah, I know, but we ended up with, we had litigation against the county commissioners in several other areas too, that they didn't follow what legal said. So all I'm saying is, it sounds like we should have a interpretation of your statement, basically, that are, you know, I don't remember that case, because I think that case was before my time. And so it'd be nice to have legal say, well, that's the way it's supposed to be done, the way Mr. Nelson says. Who's gonna say, did what, staff say, no, you can't do it that way, or you shouldn't, or did they forget that we lost in a review, or?
What I just relayed is the question that was asked and answered by legal counsel, was that you're not throwing the chapter out, but if the board decides that the optional chapter is up to date, it doesn't need to be reviewed again. So when you ask, has legal counsel answered this? Yes. The answer to the question is the board gets to make that decision.
Okay, is that kind of the way you recall that, or?
I mean, I guess I can't argue legal, but I think that, I don't know that what's up to date? I mean,
True.
you guys could say the whole comp plan's up to date. Forget it, we don't need to do anything.
And I think that's the crux of this specific issue is not that the entire comprehensive plan, all the optional elements are gonna be reviewed at some point, but what kind of input goes into that review?
Sure.
So is that something that the staff does and brings straight to the board? Or is that something that the staff does, brings the planning commission then to the board? I think there are some of these process steps that have been a question. And to be clear, in the original comp plan update, there was no, that staff decision on scope was gonna go straight to the board without any review by the planning commission. And that struck as really.
And that's contrary to the state law, isn't it?
Yeah,
Isn't it
I
supposed
don't
to
know
go?
about the state law, but
Well,
I do
it's
know-
supposed to, I mean, under growth management, it's supposed to go to the planning commission, is my understanding.
So that's to say that I think you're correct that it is, you know, if there is a review and the board decides that, you know, the review is this section is adequate and we don't need to review it again, that's fine. I think the underlying question is what kind of process does it go through before it gets to the board?
Mhm.
And I know from my conversations with the Department of Commerce, I talk to the growth management folks all the time, relaying that it wasn't gonna go through the planning commission, there was much dismay expressed. So I don't think that was kind of a standard process.
Yeah, we had the similar conversations with Commerce as well. I think the way that you frame the question, that we frame the question, you can get a different answer. Planning is messy, right? And so we asked some of the similar questions from staff's perspective, and they said if that's your standard procedure, which it has been, then proceed. And I think it goes back to that top line. At that moment in time, staff had a perspective, and I'll go back to what I said our main goal is to move forward on the docket items as directed by the Board of County Commissioners. And we continued the process that we've been doing for decades. And the Planning Commission had a different perspective on how they wanted to include their input. And staff said, if you've got that perspective as a body, send information up to the Board of County Commissioners. We aren't part of that conversation. We're going to tell you what we've done in the past as directed by the Board of County Commissioners. And so I think back to your point, that's exactly, I think that's where the disconnect comes in, right? Is we're not gonna try and interpret what you think the Board of County Commissioners is trying to say. It's like, that's messy. If you've got something that you'd like to share, feel free to share it. I think that going forward, I think we could be more clear when we get to those points of saying, heard, acknowledged, we're going to move forward with our process unless directed differently from the Board of County Commissioners. That might be a helpful way to readjust.
You said, you're talking to Commerce, if that's what your standard procedure was, then you're okay. But what about if your standard procedure was not proper? You can't just continue on. You know, if you were missing something, you just can't continue to leave it out just because, well, that's what you used to do. I mean, we got to get away from, well, that's the way we used to do it. That's the way we're always going to do it, because we might have been doing it wrong.
So A, we weren't doing it wrong, and B, the process is informed by you. If you'd like us to do something differently, we can.
Well, no, I mean, I don't know if it's wrong or right. I'm just
It's right.
saying that might be a situation for a legal
Well,
question, you know?
in terms of process, I mean, there's been several things where the process hasn't been right. I mean, there's been several codes that need updating just because, and I think to say, well, the process is set by you, but then we don't know kind of the intricacies of what's going on, and we're not being informed of the intricacies that are going on, and maybe the feedback from Commerce. I think that's where, again, the communication gap is coming from. And is there a way for more information of like, there is, you know, some questions about the clarity on the process of the comprehension plan. This is the feedback that we've gotten from Department of Commerce. This is how the county process is laid out. Is there anything that the board would like to change? I mean, just having those conversations and work sessions, I feel would help the board be a little bit like, oh no, like our process is good to go, like check, you know, proceed as is, or well, maybe we need to like change some things, or, you know, like make the process a little bit, adapt the process a little bit more. I think in terms of that, there can be some more, I mean, because processes, while, you know, previous process might be good to go and great, there might be some changes that we could make to improve the process. I mean,
There's definitely always changes to improve. I think it's hard to recall back, but the presentation that was provided by Dan Penrose, this presentation, he started off with this slide, so back to the presentation. And I thought it was a pretty good point that planning is messy, right? It's complicated, and it's not A to B. It's all these other pieces. And I love the concept of engineers
What
go.
page are you on there?
It's the very first one. Engineers go from point A to point B. Planners go from point A to, have you thought of C, right? And that's what this, I think, demonstrates. And so in that conversation with the presentation, if you remember the stair step of our process, the three main pieces to the docketing items that we go through pretty much every year, the folks that presented from Commerce said that the Board of County Commissioners, Thurston County, is pretty good at the way that we do our docketing process, that it's transparent, that it allows room for input. So I'm open to receive input and information, but you've already received third-party perspective from Commerce directly to you at this presentation, that the process that you all have put in place is actually pretty good for the Washington State. So again, always room for improvement.
When did they give us that, attaboy, if you will?
It was at that
The
presentation,
presentation. I could give you
the short course on
initial-
planning.
The one when we signed up and took, either came in person
Yep.
or,
Yeah, I think you attended. in
I
person.
attended.
In
Yeah.
person, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's
Does
hard
that
to hear
mean
good
like
news.
we've always been doing good, or you've been doing good since yesterday? I don't know the answer to that. And I have to say, my big concern is, as we deal with all this, and actually it's one of the reasons I ended up in the position I'm in here today, is we had the biggest land use ruling against Thurston County that there's ever been, I think. And that was $16 million against the county. And it was verified by the Washington State Supreme Court. It was 9-0 against the county. And that makes me nervous. I like to pay attention to the courts, I guess, because I've worked with the courts my whole life. And when they slap you that hard, I want to make sure that I'm getting it right. So that's why I raise questions quite often, and I want to make sure we get this right.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I think going back to Commissioner Mejia's point, there is always room for improvement. There is always room for clarification. And just the conversation that we have with the Planning Commission members to have a formal communication from the board to the Planning Commission, from the Planning Commission to the board, I think is going to take us a long ways. And if I may go into I'm still licking my wounds about the lawsuit that we lost. But if you may remember, the genesis of that lawsuit is because a commissioner got too close to a permit.
Well,
And that's how we lost that. It's
Right.
because a specific commissioner got too
Where-
close to a permit, given a direction to stop that commission shouldn't have.
But where did they get too close? Was it at the planning commission? Was it some other nefarious activity? Whatever took place, took place. I don't know all
Well,
the
it took
particulars
place,
because I
that's
wasn't
what-
here, but
I mean,
something happened that went awry. And in the end, the taxpayers lose.
Yeah.
And that is my concern, that we get it right. Whatever right is, I guess that's in the eye of the beholder. But it's kind of why I try to pay attention. And then citizens, a citizen committee like the Planning Commission, I think they should be given quite a bit of leeway to do what they need to do, so it doesn't look like we've got our thumb on the scale, so to speak, so.
Rob?
Thank you. Just a couple of points. The fun part about comprehensive planning or any planning, right? There's 39 different ways of doing it because each county approaches it differently. And so therein lies the challenge. It's hard to compare apples to apples from one jurisdiction to the next, but definitely the general construct is to review and revise as necessary. Because with any planning document, you don't necessarily throw it out and start anew, because you never then make progress that you can actually measure as to how you are moving forward and moving the needle. What I'm hearing is really definitely that structural piece, where the board establishes what that docket is, and then the professional staff really develop that scope and sort of the work plan, because some deadlines are established, are regulatory, others are not, and they're a little bit more fluid, but it's that refinement of the scope and how we can have that refinement happen from the board as well as the Planning Commission, and establish that two-way communication. So I'm sitting here thinking, I almost see a flow chart of sorts in my brain, really trying to say, where are all the decision points and how do we improve communication, and getting back to Ramiro's point really about that formal communication. So it is written and documented, so it's not left to interpretation. And how do we kind of structure that? So anyway, just some initial thoughts from listening in.
I don't think, I mean, just my last comment for me, listening to everybody, I mean, I don't think that it's, and Rob kind of put an exclamation point on this, I don't think there's clear answers to like these questions. Like we can look in a law and, you know, we can look at an RCW and it's like, this is when the planning commission's gonna tell, you know, that's not, it is organic and we work on a dynamic for what works for Thurston County and our relationship. And I'm just looking through this short course, I was double booked, couldn't go. I did go to it in 2019, but I hadn't worked with the planning commission before. So now I'm looking at this with new eyes. And, you know, all the principles are here, you know, respect and support the commission's roles and prerogatives. If we say, hey, we gotta get this done in a year, then you guys, you know, speed that up. Doing all these different things though, and what we're maybe missing here is effective planning commissions have good communication with the commissioners. And maybe that's where we're, Joel, you highlighted that, maybe that's where we're just not, we don't have quite enough of a understanding of how that communication flow goes so that you can be effective, because that's one of the principles that's listed here. So, I mean, I guess my main point is, looking for an answer, I think, is probably a waste of time. It's, you know, it's what we should just discuss, like what works best for us in terms of the flow of communication, the form of that communication, what types of items we do get the communication on. I mean, you guys were talking about the comp plan scoping. We did, I don't know how we got there, but we did ultimately have a set of votes from you guys, right? It wasn't like 6-2 on this and 7-1 on this,
On the
5-3
optional,
on
on
this
the
one?
optional items, yeah.
Yeah, I remember we debated those. So you guys got to the point where you actually took votes on each item and whether you thought we should include it. And then we got that. Staff put together, that was part of our PowerPoint. And, you know, and we weighed that. And I
And then
think
at the board level, the inclusion of the optional items were split vote.
yeah, it was a split vote on that and we ended up including everything. But I mean, if that works, you know, I guess I'm trying to, I'm gonna go back to like, is it that you were being told up front not to even do that? Or is it that there's something about that that's insufficient as to what you would have wanted to have communicated to us?
It was a really rocky road to get to that
Okay.
vote that we sent to you. I think unnecessarily so too. I think
Okay.
the process was really unclear. When I first asked, like, you know, does this mean that there's no substantive role for the planning commission in the comp plan scoping process? The answer was yes, and if you have thoughts about that, you need to go to the, you know, you can provide public comment as a planning commission. That just didn't feel right at all. I think that was a, you know, I think if we'd had some more process clarity, it would have been a much smoother road to get to where we got.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think that had been a major concern of mine, because honestly, it, you know, it put the planning commission, you know, put the staff in the middle of, you know, where the planning commission wanted to go. And that was really unfortunate.
You would have felt better if the process had been set up to say, you guys get to debate those items and give a vote, and that'll go to the Board of County Commissioners, and then you'd have felt better about that.
Or even if we had been told, well, if the planning commission thinks that there's, you know, a role for the planning commission in the scoping process, you can send that letter to the Board of County Commissioners. Our goal is just to move this as fast as possible and get this docket clear. Like, that would have been adequate.
Yep.
But we were even told that, you know, we don't, you know, we can't make resolutions, we can't send, you know, we're basically told, we weren't really given that option of like, well, if, you know, if you really don't agree with this, here's the pathway. And I think that
Was the pathway out the door if you didn't agree, or what?
it felt like a dead end was really what was kind of conveyed, or at least the way I heard it.
And again, I'll own that it was not clearly communicated. It was communicated, but it wasn't clear enough that as a body, if you have a different path, that you always have the option to communicate to the Board of County Commissioners. And I think, again, I think this is exactly why this discussion is important. I think we learned a lot of lessons in that discussion, and never before we were trying to be responsive, staff setting up that process to allow for that conversation to take place in a formal way, because the Planning Commission, as you saw from the votes, didn't agree on everything. And so for the staff to then to try and interpret what the planning commission is saying to the Board of County Commissioners is not proper. And so we found a path forward where some commissioners were thinking something and other commissioners were thinking something else. And instead of us being the mediator, the staff getting in the middle, like you say, I think it's a good apt description. Taking those votes is a good new process that we've never done before. So sometimes roads are rocky. I think that we've learned from the past couple of months. I think that we'll include that in the process going forward.
No, and I think the comp plan review is kind of a different animal. I think for the most part, when we've had discussions about the docket and what's coming to us, we've been like, okay, this is what the county commissioners want us to do. But this isn't just, because usually a docket item is something, I mean, 9 times out of 10, it's either something that's changed in state law or changed by a court ruling or that somebody specifically has asked for. So if I'm saying, you know, I think in this zone, I should be able to do this, that doesn't require us looking at everything that goes on in every zone. And so there's sideboards there, and I've always been fine with that. The problem I have is when we're supposed to be doing a comprehensive review of the comp plan. And we're told, well, you don't even need to look at this stuff. That was where it got me, because I can tell you, I know staff will argue this, but I've been on the planning commission since 2006. Thurston County has never done a comprehensive review. I mean, opened up the books and said, this is what we're gonna do while I've been on the planning commission. I know I was told one time that we did it at some point, but I can tell you at that point in time, obviously, as you all know, ag's my interest. I wanted to change the zoning codes for ag. I was told that's not in our scope. And so that's another reason why I'm coming at this from the point that we need to me personally, I think we need to look at anything that comes to our public hearing and ask, you know, and say, okay, does that person have a point? Does this need to be changed? Not say, you know, don't even come talk to us about that, and we're not gonna, and if you do, we're not gonna consider it.
Isn't that kind of what happened where we ended up with Ashley? I mean, wasn't it kind of, didn't that bring, I don't know, you guys then made a recommendation to us.
Well, yeah,
You're
that
not a
was,
farm person.
that was a different thing, I think.
Oh,
That
was
was a
it?
different thing, yeah.
I
She was
think
my
that-
budget priority, that
I
position.
think what you're saying is right, though. I
But it
mean,
really bit reinforced the recommendation of the planning commission to look at the ag element in a little more detail.
Well, I mean, I can say, if you look at the county's, I can't remember, strategic plan for working lands, hiring somebody to be an ag representative or liaison, whatever you want to call it, has supposedly been a priority of the county since maybe 2008, 2010. So, I mean,
I think that taking it up a level, just, you know, if you're reviewing something and the board said, we're not gonna review this item, but you get a lot of input that suggests to you as a body that, wow, if the commissioners had known this, they might have thought differently, then that's where I think you guys can decide to send us input and say, you know, we just had a public hearing, we took a lot of, you know, there were these elements were brought out. We suggest that you reconsider the decision about, you know, this item. And that's what we'd want to hear. And we may say no to that for whatever reason. We don't have any money or whatever, you know, whatever. But I mean, that's appropriate, you know, because you're part of a process, and, you know, like we said no to an ag zoning review, and then but you've got a train of farmers here saying this isn't working, and they give good reasons that we had no idea about. I don't know, I mean, that's the way I see it. I don't see it as like, we've shut you down for time eternity. Don't ever talk to us about, you know, something that you think we've got wrong. That's where we gotta strengthen that communication band that Joel was talking about between your commission and our commission.
So somewhat what I'm hearing from you guys is that you're comfortable with allowing us to become more independent and not just take staff verbatim, which sometimes I think we do or we have in the past, which we just, like staff says, we can't do this, but we think we should.
Yeah, I don't think staff's the gospel myself.
Where it's come up as an issue, I mean, absolutely yes. When it comes to information and ideas and stuff like that, where I think we've come into a little, where I feel like there's a gray area, and I'm not saying, I don't know where the right answer is, but if where you want to go is then going to take staff resources and time and things like that, then we've got to, the board has to be able to consider that, whether we want to have you go in that direction. So that's where we have to get, we have to get sort of a process down for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that because, the board established the scope, right, right, different. It is what it is. That's the legislative duty. And the staff goes through that parameters. If there's any deviations that planning commission sees, I think it's worth to send that back to the board to consider. But it has to be formal, it has to be formalized in a way that, because as any board, maybe split votes. I think you need to engage in that conversation, whether it requires additional resources, more time, or increase the scope of work. A formal document to the Board of County Commissioners will be extremely helpful. And I have to say the board reads all that. And the last example is when a minority report on a particular item, all that was sent out to the public to review. And that's the due diligence I believe the board is practicing on the feedback they receive from the planning commission. But I key on that formal documentation. And I think a formal documentation from the planning commission to the board and vice versa, I think is going to take us a long, long ways. I think it's going to eliminate a lot of misunderstandings.
And can that, and I just want to ask, because I want to keep things as simple as possible, can that formal documentation be simply a vote of direction to have the chair send us an email? We don't, you don't have to sit there and like put a letterhead, and I mean, we can be more informal about communication. It's just that it needs to be, we need to know, like, that the planning commission has voted to ask us to reevaluate X.
I don't know if it's appropriate for me to speak on behalf directly to you without going through staff. I think that us formalizing what we want as a commission and then sending that to staff and then staff seeing it, that's probably the appropriate way to do it. Obviously, I don't have a hard time reaching out. It doesn't hurt my feelings to do it, but I don't know if that's the way we should set up a program.
I think that's, in terms of process, I think that's fine, just to keep that formal communication. If the planning commission had a perspective that was shared or a vote that was taken, we as staff could send that to the county leadership without any edit or commentary. I think that's appropriate, but finding a way to formalize that top line and strengthen it, I think is a good idea. However, the planning commission feels comfortable in that process.
I think one of the concerns or frustrations might be the time that this takes. So if the planning commission meets twice a month and they have something that they want to go to the board, by the time we've discussed it, we've written this recommendation, we push it through, it gets to the board and gets back to us, we could have 2 months that have passed, and by that point it might be done. I don't know what can be done to speed that up any, especially since if we only meet twice a month, we're the weak link in that chain. We're just not getting stuff done fast enough. So I don't know what the solution there is.
Yeah, that's an interesting, yeah. That's a good point.
I think if we're trying to strengthen that top line that Joel pointed out, I think we need to make sure there's no delay if you feel that something needs to be addressed, a question needs to be answered. Because policy, one way or the other, can be directly affected by delay. And so who's the gatekeeper of hanging on to that until we get that piece of information that you felt we needed? I mean, like right now, I'm quite concerned what Mr. Nelson said about we haven't done an adequate review. If in fact we're supposed to be doing an adequate review or a review, I don't know the process myself, but I think we ought to be doing that. And, because if we're not doing it, it becomes part and parcel of, the litigation that we may end up in. Somebody brings an action against us for this, that, or the other. And if we haven't been doing what we're supposed to do, that opens us up. I mean, it might not be a deciding factor, but it's kind of circumstantial about you're not paying attention. So
Well, we
that's.
voted to do we voted to review.
No,
it
but
all.
I'm just talking about the review.
Maybe
that
not on the
Mr.
same,
Nelson.
maybe not because of Scott's point that we had to, but we did, so we're good for this review. Right?
Well, and I think the point that I made at one of our meetings was, I don't think that we have to do a deep dive into every chapter. But I think we need to leave it open to let the public tell us what they think too. I mean, because I don't think you guys have had, I'm sure you guys haven't had any public hearings on this other than your docket setting. You know, there might be something that, there's 9 of us, but there's in a document that big, there's always something that all 9 of us could miss. And I didn't want to be in the position of, us reviewing this document and somebody coming back to us and saying in a public hearing, well, I think you guys should change this, and us being in the position that we can't because it's outside of our scope.
And I think an additional point there is that the budget for this process gets set at a certain point, and we could have information come to us later from the public that makes us think, well, wow, we should really actually spend a little bit of time on this, but there's no budget for that because the budget has already been set. And so that becomes a difficult issue
I was gonna
to work through.
ask a point on that.
Go ahead. 'cause
So I
that's
was gonna, I mean, that's an interesting point that you made, and I guess I'm looking at Josh, like, I see the logic of what you're saying, so I'm wondering, is it like, if we add it, the review is a certain level of depth, like set in stone? Cause you guys kind of presented, like, this is gonna cost 70, if you do this chapter, it's gonna cost 70,000. Is there an intermediate dial where you sort of leave it technically open so that public can make comment about it, but you're really not planning to do the same level of, like, are there intermediate dials that can be turned so that you could get to what Scott's trying to say without doing a full review of every single optional chapter?
The whole thing is an intermediate dial. It's planning, it's not engineering. And so it's open. What we're doing with the comp plan, in fact, I'm thinking of this conversation right now as a really positive moment in time. We're gonna head into this new comprehensive plan review process. We're just barely at the very beginning of this process. And so that we're talking about how we're gonna interact and how we're going to reach out to the community, I think is extremely positive. And you think of organizations and groups and their decision-making process, forming, norming, performing, right? I feel like we're in this really helpful storming phase right now, where everything is kind of just out there in this like discussion point. And as we can start to get to some thoughts on norming, it's gonna help with how we communicate in the comprehensive plan. The budget that we provided is a educated guess on the amount of time that it's gonna take for outreach and input and research. And all of this conversation is exactly what goes into that. It's staff time, it's ensuring that the community is engaged. But again, it's not engineering, it's not A to B. And so the dial that you're speaking of, we think we can accomplish the goals within the budget that's been set for us. But having this conversation about how we're going to do it, I think is gonna really help as we move forward in the process. But it's hard to remember that we're at the very beginning of this visioning process for the comprehensive plan. This staff that you have currently in long-range planning is ahead of the curve. Last time we were way behind by 6 years, and I wonder if some of that leftover, that residual feeling is still with our community, that we're gonna get behind the 8 ball again. It's not the case. I think that staff and the Planning Commission have done a really good job of setting us up for outreach, for being out there in the community. We've just been at events where hundreds of people have participated in input for the comprehensive plan, way ahead of the curve. And so when you think about budgeting and process, I believe the staff has done a really good job at doing that. I think that the planning commission speaking up and trying to find places where we can do better, I think is great. I think that the Board of County Commissioners, if you think about Scott's comment, it's a nuanced comment, but your comprehensive plan is your vision for what you think the community should look like. If you look at that comprehensive plan and you see that the vision is not, I would urge you to read the document. If that's not the vision that you see for our community for the next 20 years, then let's have a conversation about that, because the time is now. If you think that that's not the right vision, then we need to be talking about that sooner than later. Our perspective from staff is that the Board of County Commissioners has affirmed that vision in the comprehensive plan every year. So it's not staff saying you can't do something. This is staff reflecting to the Planning Commission that the Board of County Commissioners continues to appreciate the vision that's stated in the comprehensive plan. But if that's changed, then we should know as staff so we can communicate something differently.
I'd like to go back to your point of the budget. The Board of County Commissioners set the budget. Biennial, we're in the process of this fall to do the 24-25, and we have a midterm adjustment. And the decisions the board made is set the stage on the budget for all the offices and departments across the county. Things change during the budget, during the year. And from your perspective, that if that is the budget, if the planning commission sees that something needs to be addressed that requires resources and funding, that is something that needs to be sent to the Board of County Commissioners to determine whether that needs to be included in a budget amendment. And the budget amendment is what the board exercises twice a year, is to capture those unexpected circumstances on every office and department. So there always that is that door open through a formal process to where the board can amend a budget if need be. So I don't think there is a straight line to say, we need more resources, send a request for the board, and the board can take an action. Is a budget process that we need to follow in terms of the amendment. That is an avenue as well.
Somebody's over there.
KP, go ahead. Kevin?
Can you hear me? Sorry.
You know who was.
I'm here. Thank you, Chair Mejia. So I apologize for not being there in person. A couple of work emergencies made it impossible for me to be there. But I have been listening to the call. And my first comment, I have a couple of questions and a comment. My first comment is that we were describing the process and the input from the staff and direction and limitations of what the Planning Commission felt like, were limitations to input we were able to provide. And just specific to the comprehensive plan, one of the most bizarre circumstances we went through had to do with we were told that the public engagement was going to be a very important element and that we needed to improve the way that we do public engagement and that it had to be vastly improved upon what we've done historically. And we then got feedback from staff where the staff told us directly if we wanted to participate in the public engagement element of the comprehensive plan, then we could attend one of the special listening sessions and take notes for that. And I'm just curious, that to me seemed very odd. And it struck many planning commissioners as a very odd role for us to play. Was that direction from the Board of County Commissioners? Was that what the Board of County Commissioners said that the Planning Commission ought to do?
I'll jump.
Not on no. I never heard anything about
Easy
it.
answer to that question, no.
That's correct. Yeah, no, the board did not make that determination. That was my direction, Kevin, in trying to be responsive to the Planning Commission's interest in getting direct input from folks on the comprehensive plan. And so I think that staff did a really nice job of trying to understand what the Planning Commission's perspective was. And we, as staff, realized that it wasn't going to work for us to play a game of telephone in the outreach that we were hearing from the community, and instead decided to provide an opportunity for planning commissioners to get direct input so that they could participate in listening sessions. It's difficult to hear that it wasn't received in the positive manner that it was presented from our perspective. Maybe that was communication styles. But the reality is, Kevin, that was my decision in an attempt to try and understand and take action on what the planning commissioners were saying. The alternative was that the planning staff had already put together an outreach plan. The professional staff, are equipped to do that outreach and then provide that information to the planning commission. But the planning commission asked for an extra step, and we tried to serve that. It wasn't well received. We heard that very clearly, and let us know what we can do better, because it's obvious that members of the planning commission may not be hearing clearly what they need from staff, and staff is doing our best to figure out what it is you all need. So I want to make sure that as we think about the past and are able to move forward into the future, that we don't let old confusions continue to color our ability to move forward in a positive direction.
Fantastic. That's a great segue to my question. So what I've been asking for, and what I wrote up in notes, several minority reports, as well as the briefing that was prepared for this, I made comments about our process, and that we have a more formalized process of how we work together with the staff to start each new project that we take on. And it feels like there's a real lack of process so far, or I guess maybe a better way I could say it is, it feels like staff does a huge amount of work, gets a project, I would say 90% baked, and then the planning commission is asked to come in at the last second and listen to that, and maybe we're allowed to make a couple minor tweaks to it, maybe not even that. Maybe we're just asked to let's just vote on this and get this done. And we wanted to be a little more involved in the earlier phases, including even directing or helping provide guidance on what some of the research ought to be in the initial phase. And so an example of that was brought up earlier, where Commissioner Wheatley had asked multiple times about help with looking up census data for the Grand Mound sub-area and for the 32 approximately census tracts that were covered in that area. And she herself was looking this stuff up and finding that she could gather the data in 30 minutes or an hour. She could gather some of it, but she didn't have the professional tools and capabilities to put it into proper maps or whatnot. She could just put it into a spreadsheet. And she was asking staff, can we get a map of this census data so that we know the exact audience we're referencing here, that we're impacting, that should even be a useful tool in doing public outreach. And it just was repeatedly back to her. The answer was no, staff is not going to research that. That's too hard, too much work. We don't have time for it. We don't want to do it. And it got frustrating because it seemed like that there was nothing there that was changing any of the docket. There was nothing there that was changing the scope. It was simply a good research that seemed reasonable to be done. I'm curious, can we improve that process? Because that seemed to be an area where there was a lot of frustration and lack of communication.
I'd look to the chair of the planning commission to provide maybe some history on that or perspective.
Well, I'm not really sure how to address that. I know that maybe one of the things that we've talked about before is the planning commission directing staff on tasks, and how much can we direct staff, and how much is appropriate for us to do it, and how much resourcing staff has to accommodate our requests. I personally feel like that us tasking staff is outside of our scope. I think we can ask you for very direct information. I think that what Commissioner Pestinger was just talking about probably would qualify for direct information, and it should be something that staff would be able to look up for us. But telling you have to do something for us and asking you to do something for us might be two different things. And I'm not sure how empowered the planning commission should be in directing staff.
I want to follow up on that, could I, ma'am?
Yeah.
I'm gonna refer back a few, I don't know, it might be a couple of years ago. I remember there was a postcard that was gonna be sent out. And boy, there was a lot of aggravation about that postcard. And then eventually I got my hands on the postcard and I couldn't read the postcard that staff had sent, and staff had insisted, this postcard is the one we're sending out. And then somehow or another, we as a commission got involved and said, well, wait, you can't even read it. How do you expect people to respond? So has that all been rectified? I just bring that up because, yeah, we want to get beyond the past, but the reality is if we haven't fixed what went on in the past, then we're not likely to get a smooth operating procedure in the future. So without knowing all the facts, did I get some of that right?
Oh yeah, you certainly did. I mean, the postcard issue was on shoreline environment designation challenges, and there's gonna be 2,200 properties in the county that would have a more protective shoreline designation placed upon them, and it was to give them opportunity to comment on it. And the planning commission was very insistent that we notify these people individually, and the decision was finally made that we'd be sending them all postcards. And then there was a lot of consternation about how these postcards are gonna be written, when they'll be sent out. And it was certainly contentious on that particular issue. It was probably 3 or 4 meetings of conflict trying to get to resolution on that particular issue. But the planning commission finally did get staff to send those postcards out, and I think that was a very positive thing.
But wasn't the postcard sent out initially with that you couldn't read it?
Yeah,
And then
so-
somehow the commissioners got involved and said, well, this isn't fair to the citizens.
Yeah, there was consternation even about what was the wording on the postcard. We had a lot of discussion about that. And
Where staff wanted to take control of everything going out, basically.
yeah, and I guess to a certain extent that it needs to be that way too. We can't just have me writing the postcard that the
I know,
county
but-
sends out.
But you couldn't read you couldn't read the postcard, if I remember right.
I just have to speak on this. I mean, I don't know who is right or wrong, but this is in my opinion, this is a clear indication of where planning commission should not be. You know, you could have been 100% right and staff 100% wrong, but to have you guys arguing over the wording of the postcard over 3 or 4 meetings, as you said, I just think that was beyond the scope of your role. I mean, you could be right, you know, but it's not about who's right or wrong. You know, if one of you felt strongly, like send us an email and then the commissioners could jump in and
I think that's what happened.
I think that's what happened.
I think.
But
it is
having you
that.
guys as a planning commission debating that, I don't think is what you should, that's not your role.
Well, I think, see, I might differ with
Well,
that.
we did differ, I believe, on this
position.
one.
And I do think that the planning commission, they're the ones with the expertise, and it was very obvious that staff was trying to put their thumb on the scale. That's the bottom line, and
It's
I
their
didn't think
job.
that
If
was
they, I mean,
appropriate.
they might have been doing it badly, but you know, that the planning commission
Well,
is not there
Not only
to.
badly, but they did do it badly. I mean, that's
Well,
why.
That's
couldn't
incorrect.
read it.
That's incorrect.
I'm
That's
just
a
saying theoretically.
value
I have no
judgment. It was not badly done. Jennifer Davis did a great job with the postcard. The font was too small. The grammar could have been different. But to characterize that as bad is incorrect. And as we're trying to retain staff, I want to make sure that we do not.
Okay, well
get
then
into
I'm gonna
that
take
territory.
exception with the director's comments here.
I take
Because
exception.
I think there is a big difference between good and bad. And when we send something out that's bad and we have to spend all the money and make a new card and send that out afterwards because the first one was bad for whatever reason, I think we can tell the truth here.
Okay, but that's for Josh to deal with, and then if he's not dealing with it, for Ramiro to deal with, and if he's not dealing with it, for us to deal with it. These guys should not have to be jerking around with that. They can let us know there's an issue so that we get it right, But this is the chain of command on an issue like that.
Well, let's come back. Let's recenter back to kind of what we were discussing, right? Which
So
was,
another 8 minutes, Madam
yeah,
Chair.
we heard Kevin's comments on the public engagement side. Josh responded to that. How are we moving forward on that, Josh, like you suggested to move forward on? What is specifically the plan on the public engagement? And that's something that I, as the commissioner, care about, but that's just one commissioner. Just because this is something that I've already been asked to talk about it at different forums. And one of the things that I've heard is usually it's marginalized communities that get left out of these big planning. And so, and those were some of the concerns I also heard from some of the planning commissioners, right? Definitely. Is how are we going to get those marginalized voices into this big comprehension plan that's really going to have the vision of the whole county, that really is going to be representative of the whole county. So just asking you, how are we going to move forward from this? And
Yeah, so thank you, Chair. We have heard that input, and I would just say that our staff, your staff, has done a great job of reaching out to those underserved communities. You may have received that packet of information, the CLO event that just occurred. We had, I think, 400 or 500 participants there. We were just at the Juneteenth events that were happening in Lacey. So that information is heard, and I can put all of that together. Again, the Planning Commission hears this on a regular basis, but having that formalized, we're out there in the community. The comprehensive plan, like I've said, is the very beginning stages of that outreach and input. So now is the time. If there are other places and events or things that we should be at to receive that information, we're open to receive. And I appreciate, again, maybe I have a hard time with being too positive, but I appreciate this opportunity. It feels a little like Festivus, where there's an airing of grievances, which is fine. But I think if we can move forward and recognize that your professional staff is not putting the thumb on the scale, does not have motivations other than to serve the Board of County Commissioners to move items forward in a timely manner with as much public input as possible. And if there's better or different ways, Commissioner Mejia, like you've said previously, there's always ways to improve. We're open to receive that. But we have to have a starting place of civility and a place that we understand that we're working for our community together. If we don't have that, as it states in this presentation, then you're going to continue to have faltering dialogue and the docket items that are presented to you. Staff is paying attention to this conversation. And I think staff is open and willing to work with the Planning Commission. We're trying to find a path forward, especially as we come out of the teleworking of COVID. We're all here trying to do this together. But if we don't have that baseline, then we're not going to be able to move forward. And I really want to make sure that as we move forward, I'm open to receiving, maybe this is an ongoing conversation that the Planning Commission and the Board of County Commissioners have on a semi-regular basis. Because staff is not in a position trying to defend ourselves. We're not here for that. We're here to try and have the Board of County Commissioners do the docket items that we've been requested to do and have the Planning Commission have as much input as you need to make those recommendations. So I want to make sure to put a pin in that we're all here working together for the community.
Commissioner Munson.
I want to just sort of where we started, Commissioner Pestinger's example about requesting the census data. And that hit on what I had previously said was kind of what I see as a gray area about, and then Jim was hitting on that. And we're not going to solve it here today, but I think it's a gray area. When you guys need something, if it's easy to get, you should have it. And as it gets to become more and more of a difficult thing to put together, then there's a gray area there. And having a process or a policy or some more discussion, a little more formalized understanding among all of us of, when, so that nobody's accusing anyone of agendas or whatever. But I mean, it's just a matter of, as it becomes more of a additional research project, then there's a point at which it probably needs to flip back to the board to give a thumbs up to. I don't know if the mapping on the census thing is, I don't know which side of the line that's on. Sounds like planning commissioners, at least some of them, thought it was pretty minimal, and staff, sounds like thought it was more than what was appropriate. But when we get these situations, rather than them having them blow up or create negative feelings, let's just talk them through.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I mean, again, I feel like those are the communication pieces that I signaled at the very beginning that can come back to the board, and the board can either be like,
It shouldn't take 2 months.
yes, or no, you know, we shouldn't proceed with that because we don't have the resources, or yes, that sounds like a great idea, we should get that information.
I'd like to have something where that could loop back to the board, like what Eric was saying about, it would take 2 months for them to put, potentially, to meet, decide, and send it to you, you send it to us, Ramiro brings it up. If there's a way to kind of get that feedback loop to where we could give a thumbs up on that or whatever, I'm
Yeah.
just thinking out loud.
No, I think that is true, definitely appropriate. And with that, on that specific topic, we had the data, we provided the data. A planning commissioner had different data, and that data didn't line up. We had Census Bureau data, but more data was brought, and that data was asked to be put into a map. Staff could have done a different communication in that process. I think going forward, we'll handle that differently.
Okay. County Manager?
So I'd really appreciate this conversation, at least from my point of view. It's not about, pointing the fingers, it's just identifying the gaps and how we can mitigate those gaps. And I think this good conversation happened today as to how we move forward to improve the process. There is always an opportunity to improve the process. But also I'd like to let you know, and this is the 5 commissioners are coming January 2024. And the county is going through a holistic assessment of all the many different boards and commissions as to how all those boards and commissions will need to be aligned with the new structure of the 5 commissioners. Related to the planning commission, we're going to be bringing a proposal to the board on the structure of the planning commission as to how that needs to be aligned to the 5 commissioners. So that is coming, and I believe I have a schedule on your planning session to help bring proposals. And certainly that conversation needs to occur with all of you, but the structure of the planning commission most likely is going to change just to be aligned with the 5 commissioners in 2024, just to give you a perspective.
Some boards and commissions aren't by district, and so it's kind of, we don't have to touch those, but you guys are 3 for each district, and now we have 5 districts, and the law says 9 is the maximum.
Right.
The formation we have.
I just learned this from Jeremy Davis. We are not a Title 36 Planning Commission. We are Title 35 Planning Commission, which was news to me. Title 36 is county regulations. Title 35 is what's originally set up for cities, but counties can set up their planning commission under Title 35, which they did, and that means that the maximum number of commissioners can be 12.
And we'll have that dialogue.
We'll have with
That's
the board
exactly-
the pros and cons of the different statutes in which the planning commission can be formed. Yeah.
Well, if there's more flexibility, great. Because right now,
Yeah, I think
5
there will
can
be.
divide into 9 very easily.
Yeah.
Kevin, you still have your hand up. Anything you would like to add?
Sorry, I forgot to lower it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, 10:30. I want to thank the planning commissioners for coming here today and for having this conversation with us. I think this is the first of many. I think it definitely is a good starting point for sure, and for how to improve our process and our communication gaps that we've been having. Want to thank Josh and his staff for attending as well. And so with that, 10:30, we are adjourned.